Mr. Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Certainly. Alderman Moore, Alderwoman Howard, Alderwoman Hubbard,
Present.
Alderwoman Murphy,
Here.
Alderwoman Spencer, Alderman Gunther,
Here.
Alderman Oldenburg,
Here.
Chairman Cohn,
Present.
President Reed. You have 5 present, Mr. Chairman. You have a quorum.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. And will you please excuse Alderman Moore and Alderwoman Howard from the meeting, and Alderwoman Spencer should be arriving momentarily. So good morning. Thank you, everyone, for your attendance today. I called this meeting due to a number of things that are happening with regard to the Northside Regeneration area, some of which has come to light over the past several months. We have a roughly 2 square mile area of the city that has struggled for a number of years, decades even, and I think it's appropriate to provide some transparency and communication from the city to both the Board of Aldermen and to the constituents of the city at large. So my intent for today's meeting is really to have the representatives from the city present current existing conditions with regard to the Northside Regeneration area, and provide members of this committee the opportunity to ask questions of the administration and SLDC with regard to any concerns that they have on the part of their residents or constituents throughout the city. And so primarily, I think this morning who we're going to hear from is SLDC, the mayor's office, the health department. I believe the health commissioner is here. Thank you. The assessor and the potentially the city councilor's office as well. So I do want to acknowledge yesterday afternoon the administration, the mayor's office, and SLDC did take a pretty serious step in the city's relationship with Paul McKee and the Northside Regeneration Plan, and that they officially and legally held them in default of their obligations with the city of St. Louis. And so that is no short undertaking. It's a very large task and accomplishment, and so I want to personally thank them for listening to the citizens of the city of St. Louis and this board. I think that we're at least moving things in a direction so that we're holding some people accountable for the lack of action that we haven't seen. So with that, I'm going to allow for Otis Williams, or actually, I believe the city councilor is here, and he'd like to, say a few words before we get started with the presentation.
All right, thank you very much, Alderman Cohn, for your indulgence. We have city officials here, and officials from SLDC are going to brief you and recapitulate the history of the controversy that now exists between Northside and the city of St. Louis. They're eager to go over that with you, and you certainly have the right to be advised of all that has transpired. A word of caution, however. I think it's evident to all of us that this matter is likely to erupt in litigation in the near future. And requesting your indulgence and your consideration when you pose questions to the officials you're about to hear from, that there are no questions that jeopardize the city's position in litigation. As I'm sure you all understand, discussions between attorneys and their clients are privileged, and they're privileged in order that discussions can be frank and strategies be concealed from your opponents. And so while we're very happy to present to you the entire history of this controversy and analysis of it, I beg your indulgence with respect to questions that might jeopardize trial strategy and trial tactics. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, Otis Williams from SLDC has a presentation, an update to provide to the committee.
Thank you.
grab your chair. Okay, Mr. Chairman, members of the board and the committee, I'm here today at your request to update you on activities essentially within the Northside Regeneration area, and also relationships. I'm sorry, and I lost my voice from yesterday, I think. But essentially documents that may be of concerns to you. So I chose to do this through a PowerPoint presentation, but I've also provided you with a copy of that presentation for your record. So can I have the first slide before? So let me just begin by saying that the city has had a long relationship with Northside Regeneration and with Mr. McKee. It began with Mr. McKee on his own, essentially quietly acquiring properties in the early 2000s. We believe it began in 2002. And so over a number of years, he acquired properties. And at a certain point, he came to the city with a vision that was a really great vision about trying to transform an area in North St. Louis. Mr. McKee also has had a sterling reputation in the past for essentially accomplishing one major redevelopment in the St. Louis County, Winghaven, and others around the region. So he came with the reputation of being able to get things done, and that was something that the city itself had been missing for a long time, to be able to do a major development of scale. So in the mid-2000s and around 2007 or 2008, the city bought into that vision and then ultimately passed a TIF in 2009. So essentially, please go to the next slide. So essentially, we began our timeline here by just enumerating when that TIF began. So again, the city, through the Board of Aldermen, approved the TIF in 2009. And essentially, that TIF is shown here, the steps that actually occurred. We went through that process, and essentially, as you can see, the Board of Aldermen adopted the TIF on 30 October of 2009. The original redevelopment agreement actually was 14 December of 2009. So that TIF essentially designated this area as the Northside Regeneration Area. The TIF the project amount that was outlined in that request was a project that would be roughly about $8 billion. The TIF request itself was $409 million. What was approved was $390 million, $600,000. So to date, the only allocation from that request is for the gas station, convenience store, grocery store that is on North Tucker around 13th Street in the amount of $2,800,000. That was approved by the Board of Aldermen as well. But as you can see in the TIF area, it was approved such that there will be areas A, B, C, and D. These are project areas and RPAs. And so essentially, A and C and B and D were to actually be activated separately. But shortly, go to the next slide for me. And shortly after approving the TIF, there was an outcry and a legal actions filed to essentially stop the redevelopment. And so over the course of about 4 years, the redevelopment was in the court systems. And so it was not until 2013 that there was a decision made to actually give us and Northside Regeneration, if you will, the okay to move ahead. So that went all the way to the Supreme Court. At that point, there was efforts to essentially restart the TIF. And at that point, the developer requested and the board approved that we would activate or at least have all of the redevelopment areas A, B, C, and D activated and started at that time. There was a public hearing to that effect, and the board essentially in October adopted the ordinance approving the plan amendment. So other key dates here is that about that same time, shortly after that, the NGA also announces that they would like to relocate, if you will. And so we have always, I believe, in the course of any comments that I've made, essentially acknowledged that Mr. McKee offered the Pruitt-Igoe site as the location for the potential relocation. At that time, all the candidate locations were thinking that the need was for 50 acres. And so Pruitt-Igoe was 35 acres, and it would just need to be amended to include another 15 acres. Shortly after Jones Lang LaSalle had gone through the process and the NGA essentially put out a NOFA, and then a short list was formed. Essentially, that short list was, those on that short list were notified that the area they would need would be 100 acres. So we realized at that point that we did not have within the city of St. Louis 100 acres that were assembled. So together with Mr. McKee, we did look at other alternatives north of Cass and elsewhere in the city. And so we knew at that time that in order to acquire an area large enough for the NGA, that it would require, one, a lot of resources, funds. It would require the power of eminent domain in order to ensure that we could get all of the parcels that were required. This is where the story separates, essentially, because at that point, while Mr. McKee did bring this opportunity to us, it was jointly acknowledged that he would not be able to pull it off as an individual developer. And so it would require the efforts and support of government to be able to essentially assemble this site. One, because of the need to use eminent domain, but also because of limited resources available to the developer. So at that point, the city and its agencies took charge, moved ahead to try and get the NGA. We were successful, obviously. It took a long time. So we went through all of the appropriate studies and all of that. So with the help of the Board of Aldermen on the 25th of March, 2015, a Chapter 99 ordinance authorizing eminent domain and other actions to assist in assembling that site was approved. So essentially, and I'm not going to read it to you here, but you can see those things that we had to get done and what the ordinance actually approved. So it authorized us to essentially provide revenue along with the anticipated revenues that would be provided by the state. So in this case, for the city, it was to take the earnings tax of the employees at the NGA and use those earnings tax from that location to essentially satisfy the debt or service the debt. That was only a small portion. We had to work again with our partners at the state. And so a companion bill, House Bill 514, was going through the state legislature, and it was approved within a couple of months of the Board of Aldermen's action. And essentially, it provided for the information that you see here. And so the state in support of this project, actually authorized up to $12 million on an annual basis to be provided to this project for 30 years. But that amount had to be negotiated based on actually the city's willingness to have skin in the game, but also on our ability to essentially identify project and project need and what we needed to get accomplished. So, so essentially, the effective amount that was negotiated was about $5.8 million from the state. So the city's 1.5 and the state's 5.8 million is essentially what is being allocated to satisfy the bond debt that was essentially provided for and to get this project done. So we have gone through a number of actions with the Corps of Engineers and with NGA, and many of those actions included environmental actions to satisfy that. We had to strike agreements in order to be able to provide this site to them as they had requested. So basically, in January of 2016, there was an amendment passed by the various boards, LRA, LCRA, and PIEA, land acquisition agreements. So in order for us to be able to deliver the site, we needed to strike an agreement with Mr. McKee that will allow us to essentially take the 97 acres that is defined as the new NGA site out of the TIF and to be able to use the proceeds that will be garnered in that area to help satisfy the debt. Essentially, when those employees moved to that new site, we needed to be able to continue to collect the earnings tax that they were providing. And actually, we're already collecting that from their current site. So in March of 2016, the NGA made a preferred site announcement, and we were all ecstatic on the last day of March when that occurred. And they began their final site analysis at that time frame. We continued at that point to go through. I said we continue. We really started in earnest to satisfy, try to complete all of the options that we had previously acquired. And so we started to close on all those options in that April time frame because we felt at that point that we had some certainty that we could move forward. We really started to rock and roll on it shortly after the June 1st date, June 2nd date, when the record of decision was announced, which essentially finalized and solidified the fact that the current site that we're preparing would be the site for the future NGA West. So this enumerates a number of other activities that did occur. On 20 December, we did close on the purchase of the NSR properties for the NGA. And 3 January, we recorded the title transfer of 551 parcels, properties. And this would be just essentially assuring us that we could have all of those parcels under one title, which is one of our requirements. Also on 10 January is the date that we actually had the Series A NGA bond issued to finance the acquisitions that we had been negotiating. To give us more comfort, the federal appropriation, the Congress actually passed the appropriation in March of 2017 that essentially started the funding for the NGA and assured us that they would, in fact, build this $1 billion facility that had been announced previously. While we were negotiating with the NGA, we realized that actually the landowner and the one that will be providing the lease to the NGA is actually the U.S. Air Force. So we had to shift gears a bit because we thought we were negotiating with one entity, but it was clear that the agreement that we were going to need to sign would be with the U.S. Air Force. And the reason for that is that, according to DOD, the largest defense entity in the area would be the owner, or at least the manager of the real estate, which is what is the situation currently at the site down south. So the site that they're currently in is actually owned and managed by the Air Force. So we began to do that, and in order for us to consummate an agreement, we had something called the Land Development Transfer Agreement, and we had to actually negotiate that with all parties to include the state and the regulators, to include DNR and the EPA. In August, we issued a Series B bond, which was an additional amount that we agreed that we would do. We essentially realized that at the beginning, when we did Series A, that the market wasn't quite right, and so we decided not to go all out. We issued a partial and decided to do a Series B. This is the Series B issuance to actually acquire the remaining dollars needed to do all of the acquisitions in the site preparation. So again, on an annual basis, we were then seeing the federal government continue to appropriate money to build the site. And I think the major activity that we're looking forward to, that in November of this year, we will actually transfer that title to the federal government, and we're on course to get that done. We think that the facility itself will actually be complete and ready to move in the late 24, 25 timeframe, more likely 2025. So just as an update on the N2W site, which is what we call the NGA site, that the city has had the responsibility to do the site prep and to do all of the work to essentially consolidate this property into one parcel. And so to do that, we needed to demolish 137 structures. To date, we have demolished 136. 96% of the site is actually site remediated, and the 4% that is not relates to the property that is the current faultless facility. We're rebuilding, not rebuilding, but building a new facility for faultless to move into. That should be complete within about 2 months. At that point, we will then demolish that facility and essentially remediate the site where it's currently located. And we will meet our timeline in November to be able to turn the entire site over. If you've not traveled along North Jefferson, you should probably do that. You can see that the site is becoming a level site. Actually, grass is starting to grow as we had proposed it would be. There were a couple of other things that we're doing, which is related to the surrounding area. We will upgrade the I-64 interchange. That in itself is a major cost, and we have been working with our other stakeholders to include the East-West Gateway, MoDOT, and others to fund that interchange. It is fully funded, and we will continue on with that. It required modifying an agreement with the Federal Highway Department, and that was all approved. We're working on the Jefferson Corridor, which is something that we also said that we would get done. And we are also looking at Cass Avenue as well to upgrade those. We have been working, or at least in the opening stages of looking at a special use district to be a companion in that area. That is on hold at the request of the affected alderman. So we're just sort of waiting to make that until we satisfy at least the requirements of the sponsor to be able to move ahead. We have also been working with the St. Louis Community Foundation to try and come up with a neighborhood benefit fund. We're in the throes of doing that, which is essentially identifying a nonprofit that where others can contribute and afford us an opportunity to provide resources from a charitable arm of the region. So, in order to secure the NGA, we made several promises. The first promise was essentially that we would deliver the site, as I mentioned. One owner, it would be environmentally clean, all the buildings would be removed, the streets would be removed, the alleys vacated, and the utilities relocated. And that's a major effort. You know, it seems simple, but over the years there have been lots of homes, buildings, businesses that were in that area, and most of those foundations were still there. Our job was to remove all of those foundations, remove all of the utilities, and essentially reroute all of the utilities around the site. The next promise, and on this one, this is the activity that will be complete. We will, in November timeframe, we will transfer this site having completed all these tasks in November of this year. The second promise was that we would do the infrastructure, and I just mentioned to you where we are on that. We are in the process of designing the interchange. We are working with a design firm on North Jefferson as well. CAS is yet to come, but it is in our outsights, so we'll move ahead on that. This particular one is also one that we were planning to, that we need to be able to do as well. And essentially, these are things that need to happen around the site. And so these are things that are yet to be done. Okay. So there are major infrastructure reinvestments. I think I've described them to you. Go to the next one for me. So essentially, when I talked about the interchange, everything in blue are things that these are new connecting, almost a connecting streets, but we are modifying the streets to make sure that they all connect. So the blue is a city responsibility. We've been working with BPS and others to get that done. That's part of the $50 million we were talking about. Things that are in purple or pink are things that MoDOT will do. That's in the state's right of way. The things that are orange are those things that will come out as part of the reconfiguration of that interchange. So where we are today. Yesterday we issued a events of default letter to the developer, Northside Regeneration, and use these items as I will go through each of them. There were 8 of them. The first default item was use and misuse of the distressed area land assembly tax credits. I believe many of you have seen a copy of the letter that was provided. I won't go into greater detail on that. The second is the default under section 3.4, no development in RPA and C. If you recall back when I showed you the map of where A and C are, essentially no development there. And section 3.4 as well, there's limited development in RPA B and RPA D. These are the areas that essentially, if you need a copy of the presentation, just, can we get a copy to them? There are some extra ones. Okay, so RPA B and D, we indicated limited development. Under section 6.6, it was failure to pay taxes. The fifth one was section 7.19A, failure to comply with the property maintenance plan outlined in the agreement between us. And section 7.19B, failure to demolish structures as outlined in the plan. And Number 7 is Section 3.1, failure to engage co-developers. And last, Section 3.1, failure to notify a property transfer. So those are the items of event of notice of default that were provided to the developer yesterday. The agreement provides the developer Northside Regeneration opportunity to remedy or cure, particularly on the monetary defaults within 15 days, non-monetary defaults within 30 days receipt of the notice, with up to a 30-day extension for non-monetary defaults. After these periods expire, the city may take any and all actions available to it under the redevelopment agreement, including termination of the redevelopment agreement in accordance with Section 7.2. So, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, that's essentially the update. If there's something, if you have questions of me, be happy to answer. I'd like to mention that I do have with me council and other staff people, so I may choose to defer to one of them who may have more information on a particular topic.
Thank you, Mr. Williams, for the presentation. I will ask if he does call anyone to the podium, if you could please make sure that you speak into the microphone and that you identify yourself and whatever organization you're affiliated with. The committee members and the general public would appreciate that. I'm going to go ahead and go through my committee roster here. Alderwoman Hubbard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. First of all, I guess I'm sort of confused. Was this the NGA presentation, or are we going to discuss what direction we're moving in light of the decisions that were made yesterday on behalf of the city?
Essentially, the last 4 slides is
okay, and so is a representative from NSR going to be able to respond to these default allegations?
So I will, I have been in communication with Attorney Darrell Piggy. Mr. Piggy represents NSR, and he did send a memo to myself and other folks, which I forwarded out to this committee last night. He will have the opportunity. He said that he wanted to submit a memo on behalf of NSR to the committee for consideration. So I will speak with him to see if he wants to present anything further other than the memo today. But he is in the audience, and I will make sure that we touch base with him too.
Okay, because I received that memo just like you did. Actually, the communication hit the media first before it even hit myself or any members of the committee regarding what took place or what direction that we're moving in. And I would definitely like to hear from NSR for them to definitely explain and lay out everything that has transpired since we initiated the TIF and everything else. But I thank you for the NGA presentation. Of course, that was one that was near and dear to my heart. I almost died on the political sword for it more times than many trying to help deliver that. And we can't, and you said it too, but we wouldn't have been able to accomplish that without Paul McKeon, Northside Regeneration. I have some questions, but I think I'll probably just make a comment, because what I perceive to be happening is, for lack of a better word, a complete shit show from various parties that will ultimately land on the back of the people. I mean, my constituents are the ones who have been waiting all these years for something to take place, a grocery store, a hospital. I mean, we're talking about 60 years of disinvestment in a community that is like so bad that we've, you know, been awarded different things, for the promise zone. All of the demographics are so poor that everyone realized that there's a need to get something done. And have we been displeased with some of the strides that we have lacked to make in that community? Absolutely so. I mean, At some points, it had gotten so bad to where I would tell NSO or Paul McKee himself, don't call me unless we're breaking ground or cutting a ribbon, because that's how frustrated my constituents are with getting something done. But I'm very cautious about this referendum on Paul McKee and all of these new developers that are coming. Well, for one, I haven't heard from them. And for two, the ones that I have heard from, they have these grandiose plans now that we have NGA without any respect or any regard for the people that have lived in that community. I mean, if people really have their dollars and they want to invest now, I look at that. Where were you for the past 60 years when, you know, we got parts of North St. Louis looking like a third world country and all the development was going to the Central Corridor in South St. Louis? So I question people's intentions, and my community is frustrated because, you know, as someone stated, this is going to erupt in litigation, and you know what's going to happen. We're going to be years ahead, tied up in court, and nothing is going to happen, you know. In a community that's still waiting on a grocery store, people have to literally go to South St. Louis to grocery shop or to go out west to grocery shop. In one of the most impoverished communities where people don't even have transportation, you know. In a community that, due to Biddle House, we have created a drug corridor where people are selling drugs on Lime bikes, okay? These are the things that are affecting my community. And to be quite honest, I could care less who develop it. I just need it to get done. And it's kind of sad when you see people playing politics on the back of the people, or people reaching out to their friends. Okay, we got NGA, now we can pull them back. We can make sure this person get that development, get this development. Okay, but we're getting that development. Is it going to create ownership or partnerships for the people that live there? We deserve better than jobs. So, I mean, it's just kind of sad because I've invested a lot of my time and energy into it, and I see how it's playing out. And it's playing out with no regard for the people in North St. Louis. And this is not about Paul McKee, not about this perceived witch hunt relationship that people always act like I have with him. I'm just as frustrated as anybody else. But I think as a city, we need to make the right choice, because for so long we have not done anything. And so many red flags have popped up since NGA. One being when you all try to push a special use district, which had some type of template or overlay in it saying that, okay, well, NGA doesn't want these particular businesses around NGA, which was complete BS. We talked to the people at NGA. They didn't say we don't want any tattoo parlors, we don't want any car washes, and those are businesses that minorities would likely have. So it made me question the direction that the city is going to or trying to go to. And if you want your corners back, it's going to be met with a fight, because people have lived in those communities too long, have suffered too long, have seen bodies drop on their way to school for just people with big money to try to come in and disregard and gentrify the community. So I'm up for a fight, and it's not even about Paul McKee, because I could particularly care less. It's about the people in the Fifth Ward who deserve something, who've been there pre-NGA, pre all these grandiose plans for downtown. Do something for them. And with every bone in my body, I'm going to make sure that they get what they deserve. So whatever games are being played, whatever political posturing that's being put out there, we all have to answer to somebody. So just when it plays out, let it play out. No further comments.
Thank you, Alderwoman. Alderwoman Murphy.
I don't have any questions at this time, thank you.
Alderwoman Spencer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director Williams, for being here today. My first question is regarding a statement you made at the very beginning of your presentation, stating, or I suppose reflecting on Mr. McKee's reputation, which I believe you called sterling, related to his prior developments. In 2011, it was announced that Frontenac Bank was suing Mr. McKee for a loan that hadn't been repaid in the amount of $7 million. That was not the only lawsuit that year. Reliant Bank also sued Mr. McKee in 2011, alleging a non-repayment of over $3 million to Reliant Bank. I hardly consider this reputation to be sterling.
Alderwoman, maybe that was a misuse of words, so sterling is not. What we were looking at was a developer who had delivered large projects, and Mr. McKee did, in fact, have that in his past, and so, and many developers, even those that are very successful, have had lawsuits or other things, and so the fact that a developer had a lawsuit in his past was not one that would disqualify. I believe that as we all look hindsight, sometimes 2015 or 2020, we can all, do that at this point and say what we should have done. But I would tell you at the time that the administration was looking at it in early 2000s and looking at an opportunity to try and have something happen. I know the Alderwoman from the 5th is very frustrated, but and we appreciate all the help that she provided in helping get the NGA. She also was very instrumental in helping us get a number of bills passed to get the redevelopment started. I think we're here because there's been very limited things happen in the area.
I can appreciate that. Looking at some of the last transactions that the city made with Mr. McKee, going back to 2014, 15, et cetera, at that point, had Mr. McKee been taking good care of the properties that he already had in ownership?
There were questionable maintenance activities, but Mr. McKee had made an effort by hiring a number of people to actually attempt to take care of the properties, and so we were aware of those hirings.
When SLDC looks at offers, for example, to purchase LRA properties, is it customary for SLDC to look at the work that the developer has done within the city limits on other properties and base their decision whether or not to, for example, sell a city-owned property to a developer based on the current condition of other properties that they own within the city limits?
As you know, our process has modified over the years as we learn other things, and so I believe that we had agreements that, if you recall, in 2009 we had a TIF agreement that essentially outlined a number of things that we were to do, and so we were committed to following that, and we also at that time continued to feel that that was the best path forward, given the direction that we were headed.
My question is more general and non-related to Mr. McKee. When looking at offers to purchase, for example, LRA properties or to do business with a developer in the city of St. Louis with city-owned properties, is it customary for SLDC to take a look at the condition of other properties owned by that developer within the limits of the city of St. Louis?
We do. We check a number of things.
Do we often make decisions on whether or not to interact or sell property to a property owner based on the condition of other properties within city limits?
It is not just one thing. We look at a total process, and so there are a number of variables that we look at.
Would you say that the current condition of other properties owned by a particular developer would weigh into the decision of whether or not SLDC would embark upon a relationship with a developer?
Yes. In fact, we, as you know, we in our LRA process always look at the condition of properties, but we also look at the overall development goal and what is the intent and the timing that is being portrayed as to get something done.
I'm glad to hear that. It's been my experience in working with LRA that the city always looks at the condition of other properties owned by a particular developer within city limits before making a decision whether or not to move forward with a particular real estate development. Does SLDC also,
Remember, what I said was about the sale of LRA property.
Sure.
I again, go back to, we look at a number of things within a redevelopment decision. So it could be the condition of the property, but it's also financing, it is also the project that's being proposed. There's just a number of things that we will look at.
does SLDC also look at whether or not a property owner is delinquent on property taxes or other fees and fines owed to the city of St. Louis before making a decision whether or not to move forward with a real estate transaction with a particular developer?
We do.
Did we do that in the case of Mr. McKee?
Yes.
What is it that granted an exception to Mr. McKee having owed, prior to 2014, amassed a debt of over $400,000 in fees and fines and had a history of not paying his property taxes on time? What was it that granted that exception? Because I know that when looking at development in my neighborhood, we don't grant those types of exceptions. And we are very strict with the sale of LRA properties to smaller developers who may be doing their best to pay taxes or doing their best to upkeep properties. We don't seem to have those same exceptions for everyone in the city.
Alderwoman, I think you're aware that there are a number of developers who are currently working in your area who have had delinquencies but have made them good. And so we basically look, and if a person will satisfy his debt to the city, that's essentially where we are.
Did Mr. McKee regularly make good on all of those fees and fines in order to move forward with this project?
At this point, the only things that I'm aware of that he owes us are the taxes that are due, the current taxes that are due.
Has he paid up? Is he current with the building division as far as demolitions and board ups and other things?
No, if you read the letter of default, you will see we itemize things that we think are delinquent at this point.
I understand that. So it's not just taxes, there are other fees and fines that are also delinquent. Can you describe the current state of the agreement with which the city of St. Louis is in? We had a redevelopment agreement signed that was passed by the Board of Aldermen in 2013, an amendment to a redevelopment agreement. How many redevelopment agreements and how many agreements exist between the city of St. Louis, Mr. McKee, LCRA, and various entities? I think this is a point of real confusion for the general public, but also for many of us here.
Do I need to maybe ask council maybe whether or not, my question here is whether or not I'm maybe getting into an area that I would prefer to either go in executive session to talk about or to either not have a conversation about agreements that we have.
All the agreements are public. They've been signed.
Sure. How many agreements are there that dictate the relationship between the city of St. Louis, LCRA, and Northside Regeneration? I realize they're public, but there's been a series of redevelopment agreements and amendments, and
Yeah, I
it
think I
becomes
could
a bit
answer,
confusing.
I can answer that question, and let me say this. I think there's a lot of confusion when the word city of, or the phrase city of St. Louis is used. I think we all should be mindful that there really are a number of public corporations that are involved in these transactions. There's the city of St. Louis, which is a corporation. There's a land clearance for redevelopment authority of the city of St. Louis, which is a different corporation. There is the land reutilization authority of the city of St. Louis, which is a different corporation. There is the Planned Industrial Expansion Authority, which is a different corporation. There's the St. Louis Development Corporation. That's a different corporation. Your question was directed at the relationship between the city of St. Louis and Northside. There are essentially two agreements between the city of St. Louis and Northside. There's the original redevelopment agreement and an amendment to that redevelopment agreement. So those two documents describe the legal relationship between the city of St. Louis and Northside.
And how many agreements exist between the other four entities that you described and either the City of St. Louis or Northside Regeneration?
How many agreements do the other corporations have with Northside? Is that true?
Well, either between each other, how it relates to Northside Regeneration. Are there agreements, for example, between LCRA
There are many agreements between the other corporations.
as it
and
relates
Northside.
specifically to Northside Regeneration?
The other corporations have agreements with Northside. The City of St. Louis's relationship, again, is described by the redevelopment agreement and the amendment to that redevelopment agreement. There are other relationships. LCRA has a relationship with Northside. LRA has a relationship with Northside. PIEA has a relationship with Northside. There are other documents to describe those relationships.
How many documents in total would you say, or how many agreements in total? I'm trying to understand or get to the crux of the
Many.
scope of.
There are many. More than, I think, you can count on one hand, but less than two. That's roughly speaking.
Less than two hands?
Less than two hands. More than.
Somewhere between 5 and 10 agreements.
Well, if you're talking about, like, this is Linda Martinez from the mayor's office. As to the documentation with regard to the support the city and its various development agencies provided in connection with the gas station and with the food market, there are many agreements. This LDC made a $300,000 loan to support that transaction. There were new market tax credits allocated from the new market tax credit entity that's related to LCRA. There was PACE financing through the Clean Energy Development Board that supported that project. So to be perfectly honest, there's a transcript that probably has 100 documents that involve numerous development agencies for just the $120 million development that's undergoing now, the construction and development. So we wouldn't be able to list all those at this point in time. There are a number of other documents that, as the city councilor has indicated.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to request that we have a comprehensive list of all these documents, given that they are all public information, but to have a sort of a compository of all of them so we can have an understanding of the depth of the agreements that we have. It's my understanding that the city issued yesterday a default letter related to the agreement between the City of St. Louis and Northside Regeneration, and that is as it relates to the amended agreement. Am I understanding that correctly? The agreement that was amended at what date?
I don't have the date, but yes.
2013.
The city issued a notice informing Northside that Northside was in default to its obligations to the City of St. Louis. Those obligations were described in the redevelopment agreement and the amendment to that redevelopment agreement.
How long has Mr. McKee been in default of that redevelopment agreement?
There are different defaults that began on different dates.
What was the date at which the first default became, that Northside first became in default of one of those issues?
I can't answer that.
I do not know the exact date, but I can tell you that, we have always looked at the response by the developer, but we always have a working relationship with developers and allow them to be able to, if you will, make adjustments along the way. Because what we want is to have redevelopment. And so many times the developer will come in and basically say, I need more time or whatever. And so we have been able to work through those kinds of things.
And I do appreciate that. I do think that leniency can play a role and be important in a long-term relationship with any developer. I'm trying to establish just how long we've been in default here, and
I think we could say this. There are defaults and there are defaults. You don't declare a person that you have a relationship with in default because there is an early default on a matter that is not particularly significant. Those happened some time ago. You end a relationship when there are cumulative defaults of significance. I think it's fair to say that the defaults relating to the state tax credits that was revealed over the past few months was something that was regarded as a very significant default. You know, the first time somebody doesn't measure up to a minor part of an agreement, you don't declare somebody in default. You show some leniency and indulgence, and you hope that it'll be repaired. But cumulatively, and when you have default after default, and the defaults become significant, then you act a little bit differently.
I would agree. And with all due respect, I don't think that the issues with which Mr. McKee has been in default were minor. You know, we have had years of just gross neglect of properties on the north side, where buildings are falling down and grass is taller than I am, and neighbors are suffering under these conditions. The community has suffered for well over a decade as the whole area has continued to deteriorate, much of which has been owned by Mr. McKee during this time.
I don't think anybody would disagree with that. It's a matter of judgment when you
Sure.
say enough is enough, and people will have honest difference of opinions about that.
So we have a lot of other agreements, as we just described. One of the questions I have is related to the future assurances agreement, something that was an agreement that was made as a sort of amendment to the original agreement, but that was an agreement that was made between SLDC and Northside Regeneration. Am I correct?
There are no agreements between SLDC, the agents.
LCRA, excuse me?
LCRA in this case. And so there were agreements that were made there, yes.
And the future assurances agreement attempts to, or directs a amendment to the agreement between the City of St. Louis and Northside Regeneration, if I read the preamble somewhat correctly.
The City of St. Louis is not a party to the future assurances agreement. It cannot bind the City of St. Louis.
Okay. And for that reason, it didn't come before the Board of Aldermen? Is that the reason why it didn't? Or is there another
The assurances
reason?
agreement is not an agreement between the City of St. Louis and Northside. Therefore, it really has consequences for the City of St. Louis, but it's not something to come before the Board of Aldermen. It's something that goes before the boards of the parties that are parties to that agreement.
But it does, but the future assurances agreement does have consequences for the City of St. Louis, as you just mentioned. How can an agreement between two entities, not including the City of St. Louis, have consequences for the City of St. Louis?
Well, it's not rare for agreements between two people to have consequences to a third person. That happens every day in everybody's life. You know, if General Motors has an agreement with the United Auto Workers about where its plants are going to be located, you know, it has consequences to the people who live in those communities, but they're not parties to those agreements. If the person who lives next door to me sells our house to a third party, that could have consequences to me.
I think it's important to note that when we do future assurances agreements and those kinds of agreements, it's generally to help both parties. And so in the case of the first future assurances agreement, it allowed us to take ownership of the properties within the NGA area. And so that is essential. So I mean, we can talk about those, but I just would caution you that we are, in fact, at a point where we expect to have litigation. And so there were reasons why we entered into these agreements. The agreements were to benefit essentially both parties in order to get to a situation such that we could do something on behalf of the City of St. Louis.
Did the future assurances agreement change the city's ability to issue or notice a default in any way? Did it extend deadlines in such a way that made issuing a default any different?
I will defer not to, and prefer not to answer those questions in open forum.
Mr. Chairman, that's all the questions I have at this time. I'd like to just note that grateful to see the city taking a different approach. I understand that we have now presented an option for the developer, Northside Regeneration, to rectify some things within 30 days. This is not, we are not reclaiming the redevelopment rights as it is right now. We are issuing a sort of an ultimatum. And it's my hope and expressed desire that the city continue to take a hardline approach to this. And with regards to leniency, that that be in our past. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Alderwoman Spencer. Alderman Gunther.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Williams, for being here. A lot of the deeper questions I'll leave my colleagues up to asking there, but my kind of question is just somewhat basic here. So, again, your presentation, as my colleague from the 5th said, had a lot to do with NGA. But looking at this, you start off in the early 2000s here, and it says that Northside Regeneration briefs the city about its vision for development in North City. Then it was 2009 when the city actually pretty much signed the original agreement based on this vision for Northside Regeneration. But then it wasn't until 2014 that NGA actually said, hey, we're thinking about relocating here. So from 2002 to 2009, this vision of regenerating Northside all the way to 2014 when it seems like luckily NGA having the option to be able to pull these things together, but there was 12 years in there where there wasn't a single rehab done, a single house built. So where are we with the actual vision that was discussed in early 2000s with leaving all this NGA stuff out? You know, what was the plan up there? Is kind of my question.
Well, as I indicated, there was a vision that was indicated that there would be residents, new businesses, improved infrastructure.
And all that was before NGA even announced.
All that was before NGA. In fact, there were, many of you probably have visited Mr. McKee's office, and the one thing that be sure that he always gave a good presentation on what he was working on. And there was always a vision, but to date, the only thing that we have seen thus far that we have been supportive of has been and approved, has been the grocery store, convenience store, and gas station. We are aware of the healthcare village because we worked very closely to get a TIF approved for the area, but that has been discussed for a long time. There's housing that has been discussed for a long time, but
yeah, so that's, I mean, that's kind of just, I guess, a statement here is that it just seems like from 2009 till 2014, you know, you had 5 years there where there was nothing done. Then NGA comes, and then we get to make a nice presentation about what NGA has brought.
This is not about making a, I was asked to update you on what was happening in the Northside Regeneration area. At this point, a critical piece of what's happening there is based around that. So if you didn't want the information that I was sharing with you, that's fine. But this is to give you a better sense of what is happening in the area, and actually the only thing that is happening of any significance is the NGA, and which is one of the reasons why we're here, other than the gas station, grocery store, and convenience facility that is there. The rest is a vision that has not been executed on.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Alderman Oldenburg.
Thank you, Mr. Williams.
Yes.
Just very quick to clarify, the original agreement was signed in 2009, but between 2009 and 2014, it was in litigation.
Between 2009 and 2013.
So I think that would clarify there would probably be some stall in any execution on the vision as a result of litigation. I mean,
There was definitely a stall, and in fact, I think we were all very excited when the litigation was over, and we thought that was would be the beginning of a new day,
Right.
in anticipation of redevelopment occurring.
Yep. How many acres, I'm sorry if it's in this presentation, but how many acres does Northside Regeneration have development rights to currently?
The area, I think, is roughly about 1,500 acres is
1,500.
what we define Northside Regeneration area as.
Yeah. And was this the largest incentive package or redevelopment agreement that the city to date, or to your knowledge, entered into?
This, in my knowledge, it is the largest that we have done. That could have been some previous, but I doubt it, given that I'm aware of all the TIFs that have been generated in the city, and this is by far the largest.
Great. Okay. Okay, I have no further questions. Thank you.
So, thank you for the presentation. Well, she's not a member of the committee.
Oh, okay. Oh, sorry.
But,
I'm giving you an opportunity.
actually, I will allow my colleague from the 6th Ward the opportunity to ask questions. Thank you for being more considerate of myself.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Director Williams. Could you briefly recap for us, because I think it predated many of us, including me, the litigation that was originally filed that made its way to the Missouri Supreme Court, just so we have an idea about what happened.
If I gave you the legal pendings for it, I would be wrong. Essentially, though, there was objections to by several citizens. There was a suit filed, and that suit was ultimately appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. I don't have the basis for the suit in front of me.
So no one here can speak to that today?
There are lawyers here who know more about it than I do, but I'll tell you what I think. I think Judge Durker found it to be invalid because it was required to have a plan. He more or less found that it was just a dream.
When you say
Wasn't
it,
that right?
can you tell me what,
Jerry, did you handle that, right?
excuse me, when you say Judge Durker found it, when you,
The trial judge.
I know that. What you say it, what is it that Judge Durker
The TIF was
invalidated?
supposed to have a plan.
The TIF.
And he didn't think it did. Is that correct, Jerry?
Good morning, I'm Jerry Carmody, and it just so happens that I represented you all, members of the Board of Aldermen, the mayor, and the TIF Commission in arguing the case in the Missouri Supreme Court. The issue is that Judge Durker had invalidated the TIF ordinance for the reason that Northside had not begun a project. So ultimately, he suggested that because the statute required at least the commencement of a project, and that is frankly just turning a spade, because of the fact that that hadn't begun, that there had been no effort in that respect, that he therefore said the ordinance was invalid and void. And so we went up to the Supreme Court and we argued, and I can remember arguing then that notwithstanding the fact that maybe there is no project, but one will soon begin, we assured the Supreme Court at that time.
You assured the Supreme Court at that time that a project would soon begin?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
And for those not familiar with gardening vernacular, turning a spade means turning a shovel. But, so Mr. Williams, I appreciate the presentation. I was hoping for more information as it pertains to NSR. I realize that the NGA is a pretty significant project, the only significant project to date that's actually being commenced in the NSR area. But can we go back to, I don't know who was controlling the slides earlier, but you mentioned in the presentation that there's been no development in areas, I believe, A and C, and then some development in areas B and D. And
Can you go to the
so
map?
the slide, I believe, would be 1, 2, 3, slide number 5.
Okay.
So where, in relation to, A and C, B and D, where is the NGA located in that area?
It is probably right along the line that's where C and D joins.
So when you're saying that there's been no development in areas A and C, you're not including the NGA in that, or are you?
I am not including, well, what I'm doing is I'm actually lumping the NGA sort of in D. So I'm saying B and D that were as limited, but I'm not, the NGA is not totally in A or in C or D. I have to overlay NGA in there somewhere to be able to tell you exactly. But my intent was to acknowledge that the gas station, which is in B, that has been done, and that he is doing some work at Pruitt-Igoe.
So, which leads me to my next question. What work is being done at Pruitt-Igoe?
Well, actually, it was actually work that was done by the contractor that we hired to do the site work, and I believe the contractor was looking for a location to put concrete that was coming out of the ground from the foundations to be able to store. I believe he negotiated a deal with Mr. McKee to use that site. So as a result of using the site, he cleared the site. But I think at the same time, Northside Regeneration was also working to try and get financing together to be able to start or at least begin work on the healthcare facility. But that I'm not aware that that has been accomplished yet.
So is Pruitt-Igoe the site where the healthcare facility is going to be built?
Yes.
Supposedly?
That is what was being briefed and as part of an ordinance passed by the Board of Aldermen to grant TIF funds to that once it is completely planned and going forward.
So, there was a news report recently which you and I communicated about with regard to debris that's being left on the Pruitt-Igoe site near one of our city's schools. You elaborated on what's been transpiring there, but I guess the question that remains for me is why are we allowing an open landfill of sorts, next to a city school?
Well, actually, it's not an open landfill, and actually it is.
I mean, it's debris from homes.
It is concrete that will be crushed and reused on the NGA site. That's essentially and so the contractor was looking for a way to have close proximity to be able to then, once the actual construction coordinated with the Corps of Engineers and others, they would be able to take it back across the street in a refined form to be able to use as a pad for introducing streets into not streets, but a path to get back into to actually do the construction.
So, and I don't want to argue semantics, but I'm going to. All along our riverfront, we have coal distribution, salt distribution, et cetera. I would argue that we wouldn't want to build an elementary school or high school next to any of those facilities. We have junkyards that, take in cars and, shred them to bits and pieces. I wouldn't want, my kids going to school next to, something that's like that. So we can argue that it, is or isn't an open landfill, but the fact remains that it is debris that's coming up from buildings that are being removed or extracted from these,
and
sites.
And it is debris that has already been tested, and so I think I would defer to Director Moore to be able to tell you more about what was found. So, this is.
But even if the debris is healthy,
But let me also say that once we were alerted that there was concern, that work immediately stopped, and there has not been any work on that site. Much to, and I counter anybody who would tell you that once we learned about it, that there was any work that would happen. There was none. There was actually follow-on meetings with the parents, the school board, with the superintendent, with everybody concerned. I think everybody had an agreement on a path forward. Yet, there have always been naysayers in the area, and they continue to complain. But I will defer to the director to tell you about, what actually, because what we found is that there's no contamination there. But yet, we also heard people say that there were dust and other things. And so to counter that, work stopped.
So, and thank you for that. I appreciate that very much. I think that's the first that I've actually heard that. So, but my question now is the pile remains there, correct?
Right.
There's nothing additional or new going to that pile. But when it comes time for that to be crushed and used for fill for streets, you know,
The plan now is to not do anything until school is out and there's no children or teachers at that location.
So, but is the plan still to, at that site where the pile is currently, to crush the debris even further to use it for fill?
So I'm going to stop at that point and just tell you that it is not our plan. This is something that the contractor negotiated with NSR, but I'm aware of it, so I'm providing you with the information that I'm aware of, okay? So I would have to ask the contractor to tell you, but I do know, though, that they are also very willing to not do it on this site. It would just be one of those things where it would be, they will have to move it anyway. And so the thought is to save money, that if it was done when there were no constituents or citizens in that area, that would be the way to go. Then it has to be moved anyway.
My only thought with regard to that is that there are still air filtration systems, you know, on schools, air conditionings, et cetera, if the schools are so fortunate to have air conditioning systems in them, that the dust that's created from that can still, you know, infiltrate the air filtration systems and end up, you know, and granted, if there aren't students or, you know, faculty there, it'll just end up, you know, as dust on someone's desk. But, you know, the schools, as we know, you know, continually, you know, come to the city asking for resources when, you know, they have their own funds for resources as well. And I just want to make sure that, you know, we're not creating even more situations for students, faculty, or the budgets.
And that's not our intent.
Okay.
But I would, just to put this to bed, because there are continued allegations that there's something nefarious going on, and I would like for, is she still here?
I think she stepped out for a moment.
Okay. Well, when she returns, I want her to say what the situation is.
I appreciate that. So, you know, another long-standing issue that we haven't talked about, but, you know, I think was very much on the minds of a lot of neighbors of mine who are very interested in historic preservation. But, you know, the Clemens House was another, you know, issue that we face as a city in our relationship with Northside Regeneration. What happened around that? You know, as an alderman, I would get emails from constituents, you know, saying, save the Clemens House, save the Clemens House. You know, the administration would tell me, you know, that, you know, the Clemens House is being cited for building violations. We're going to go after Paul McKee for demolition by neglect, you know, all of that. And, you know, as we all know, it's no longer around. So what was the city's role in that? And, you know, where, you know, are we trying to pursue anything as a result of, you know, losing another part of our city's heritage, you know, to the wind, so to speak?
Well, as you know, there was a fire, and the fire essentially destroyed the facility. And I believe, and this is another one that where the Director Moore can comment more on this, but the folks from the Health Department and the folks from the State Health Department, the folks from EPA and other regulatory agents all came in and essentially supervised the cleanup of the material that was remaining from that fire. Prior to that, there have been notifications by the building division to Mr. McKee. So I would defer to NSR, you know, speaking to that issue, because it is a building owned by them. But I do know that they did pursue and follow the guidelines and instructions as provided by the EPA. And so I believe it came to the ending was according to the guidelines that were provided, and I don't believe there was any harm provided to any individual that I'm aware of.
Is there any agreement or expectation of NSR, the properties that they own within the redevelopment area are covered underneath insurance?
You know, that when private owners take on property, it's up to them to determine whether they insure or not. We don't demand or require that.
I mean, given that this area is one of the largest redevelopment areas we've ever, supported in the history of the city of St. Louis, with, 1,600 parcels that Mr. McKee owns, I mean, wouldn't it be responsible upon us to require him to have insurance on the properties that, or in particular, the properties that he buys from the LRA?
I'm not sure that he does not have insurance, so I'm not saying that whether he does or does not. I think the assumption that we had was that he had insurance, and I believe that through this process with the Clemens, and the NSR people can speak to that as to whether or not they did or did not, but I believe they did.
So one of the other things that we've, been presented with today, we're looking at spending tens of millions of dollars on infrastructure improvements. Mostly it seems to support the NGA. The NGA is, fairly squarely in the middle of this Northside Regeneration Plan. What is the time frame on, those projects being,
Our commitment is to
started,
have them
completed?
complete by the time that the NGA is actually complete. And so we know some of this is dependent upon the cycle of funds coming through the various agencies where we are receiving them from. And so we probably will start with the interchange in 2019. That could be complete by 2021 probably. Shortly after that, then we are committed to moving forward with Jefferson up to a point. And so the idea is that we would not have major construction around the NGA site, given that they will be in and out of the street and with heavy construction. And then essentially, as they near completion, we would finalize that in the 2023-24 timeframe.
So what, I mean, obviously NGA is, going to have, supposedly 5,000 jobs, maybe up to.
No, there are 3,100 jobs
currently. We were told that
currently,
they
and
could hire up
there's no
to-
one who has said it's going to be more. We are hopeful that it will be more. And so I just don't want us to be a party to providing different numbers than what has been committed to. The number is 3,150 actually, to be exact. And so there are negotiations going on to have other potential employees there, but for right now, I would caution us to be at the 3,150 number. That's where we are.
So with that, obviously that coupled with the infrastructure enhancements along Jefferson, Cass, and the like, have you been approached by other developers that are interested in, either residential or other projects in that vicinity?
As you know, our redevelopment agreement, the agreement that you all approved, essentially allows for 25% of the area to be redeveloped by other developers. And in fact, one of the things that we were hoping is that the developer would seek out other developers. So we do not have a developer in tow. Folks have accused us of doing this because we have somebody else. We do not. But what we would like to see is for interested developers to actually come in and, in fact, do work on properties that are not controlled by NSR.
So is the answer to my question, no, you have not
No,
been approached by
we have
any-
not. And those that have come to us, we have forwarded or asked them to meet with NSR. And they have, over the years, there have been a few of those, not more than a few.
And in your referral over to NSR is your intention for them to be part of the 25% that's, building that's not NSR, or is your intention
Opportunity
to
for
have them to partner with NSR?
it could work out where it could be a co-development agreement, or it could be that they could work with them on some, buy property from them and essentially do something separately.
So, one of my concerns when we first passed the redevelopment area, actually, I believe it was in the first year that I came down to the Board of Aldermen, I remember having a conversation with Mr. McKee about things like rent control in the area and providing for, stabilized housing for those that, currently live in the neighborhood so they're not being displaced. Have we come any further, in the years that this has been around and making sure that we're not, obviously the NGA, we displace people through eminent domain, but the area around here, is still, very much populated, by working class families and lower middle income families. What are we doing to ensure that they're not going to get displaced? I'm slightly disappointed to hear that we haven't had any, significant developers that are interested in being part of the 25% that aren't Paul McKee redeveloping in the area. But, what are we doing to ensure that there isn't further displacement, of residents that live in this area?
So through Project Connect, which is another program that we formed to essentially help facilitate the redevelopment, we did explore and did a lot of research on what other communities were doing to try to assist with keeping particularly the taxes from increasing once redevelopment occurred. And we looked at all those options, and we actually worked with the assessor to do that. We went out and had a couple of meetings with citizens in the area to talk about it. Had one at Vashon High School and another at another location within the area there to talk about that. And so at this point, we do not have anything because, as we found in other areas, the laws of affecting it were essentially very difficult for us to get around, because one of the things we found, at least from talking with the state assessor, is that what you do for one, you got to be sure that you're able to do it for all. So you can't carve out little places. And so we have gone through that study. It's been dormant for a while. We can bring it back up again, but it's one of those things that is important to us. Just don't have a solution for it yet.
Certainly as NGA comes to completion and, the infrastructure projects come to completion,
right.
I think that that's something that we need to, be more judicious in approaching and making sure that we're being sensitive to the needs of the community. This is actually the first that I've heard about the special use district that, was being proposed for the area in terms of presenting it as the NGA. I've realized, and we have had conversations with the board about a special use district, but it being presented as, the NGA wants to see this or doesn't want to see this.
That is not the case. That is an error. So what actually occurred, there were well, what do we call those things? There are two categories, Jay. What are they?
Permitted and conditional use.
Yes. And so the conditional uses are those things that the Alderwoman enumerated, and they are things that can be modified. They are not things that were required by the NGA. We never promoted it as that. Okay, I won't go there. All right, so the other, though, the primary piece is, in fact, things that were required. There were like about 5 or 6 things that were required. And those are things that we need to do. The other piece was the conditional part is what we actually do in all the other special use districts we have in the city, which is trying to just define the I call it criteria for being able to redevelop in the area. And the thing that we always said is that those people that are in the area are grandfathered in. It does not impact anybody. So I'm not going to get in a debate over that because we aren't doing that one right now. But I just want to be sure that we're straight. It is not what was as it was categorized. and I will defend that to the death.
So, and I'm very familiar with special use districts because I've been trying to get one in my ward for the last 9 years. So who has been working on the special use district? Because my understanding is that it's supposed to be the planning department that does that, and we have 2 city planners in the planning department.
So we have been working with Mayor Hart in zoning, with the planning department, and with also Project Connect. We were all working together. We realized that there were some requirements that the alderman wanted to have happen in the area. So that was stopped. We agreed that we would do certain things within the area with the citizens, make sure everybody was on board, and until we meet that requirement, we will not be back before the board.
Okay. My last question, so I remember when the NGA came around, we did a huge presentation around it. There was a whole cost-benefit analysis that was provided for the city, in terms of, the finances for the incentives that we were using versus the revenue that we were going to be getting. Have we done anything, with regard to the NSR and some sort of cost-benefit, evaluation?
We did. We did a market analysis, and we've taken a look at it. We shared that with Northside. We have very detailed numbers about what can happen and the probability of what the yield would be to the city. The one thing we did find is that the 390, it's impossible to essentially use $390 million in TIF in that area, just because so much time has passed, and because just impossible to execute that much redevelopment. And so all those things are a result of this study. It's available if you like.
I would very much like a copy of that study. Do you know when that was conducted?
We did that probably 18 months to 2 years ago.
So, and you brought up the TIF and the $390 million. So the $2.8 million in TIF funds that have been allocated, what projects have those supported primarily?
As you know, with TIF is supported by the economic activity taxes that the project itself will generate. And so this is a projection that NSR provided, that our analysts confirmed. And so the basis for that TIF amount is based on that amount of what their request has been. And so so that goes into those economic activity taxes will go into a special allocation fund that is controlled by the comptroller. It is then drawn out to help satisfy the debt that Northside will generate.
So, but I guess my question is, the $2.8 million, what economic activity has been driving the $2.8 million?
It's projected to drive. So when the store opens, whatever the taxes are,
so the $2.8 million is for the grocery store and
yeah,
gas station?
Yes. The thing that people always yell about TIF is like the city is writing a check. We only write the check once the money come in. So if the project does not generate the money, then it doesn't get it.
But
right?
that's my question. What projects are benefiting?
It is the
project
that will generate this TIF money will be the grocery store, the convenience store, and some portions of the gas component. Obviously, gas does not contribute to. Taxes on gas does not contribute, but that complex, that whole complex.
Convenience store portion of the gas station
Yes.
would generate.
Right.
Correct. Okay. Okay. That's all the questions that I have for now, but I'll swing back through the committee if anyone has additional questions, and I see Alderwoman Spencer does, so.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to clarify one thing regarding the economic benefit to the city of St. Louis that the NGA site will bring us. It was reported in 2016 that the earnings tax from the workers at NGA generates about $2 million annually for the city of St. Louis. Is that
Since that time, the numbers have been adjusted upward. So at that time, the average salary, as we knew them at the time, was $75,000. Since that time, because of the financing requirements we've had with the bonds, we have confirmed through a study through the NGA that the average salary, that includes their on-site full-time consultants, is $98,000. And so the $98,000 annual salary for the 3,150 employees is what is at stake.
I'm sorry, what is the annual earnings tax generated by the 3,100 employees?
Obviously, I do the basic math on the 3,100. So 3,150 times the 1% earnings tax, whatever.
And how many of those employees currently live in the city of St. Louis and would pay earnings tax anyway, regardless of where they're employed?
That's a small number. It's less than 500.
So less than 500 of the 3,100 people that are employed there actually live in the city of St. Louis?
At one time when that was taken, when that survey was taken, that number obviously evolves over time, so I'm not sure what the current number is. But as you know, everyone employed at that site will pay.
So, but of course, when you file your earnings tax, remind me, is it a straight 1%? Are there exemptions? Are you paying based off of your federal income tax? I can't remember exactly how the tax law for the earnings tax works.
I don't purport to know the math for it, so I'll defer to someone else. But
sure. So if we assume that there's still 500 employees that are still working that live in the city of St. Louis out of the 3,100, we have 2,600 employees that are paying earnings tax that would otherwise not be paying it, generating without exemptions in your tax law bills $2.5 million a year annually in
we think
earnings
it's closer
tax.
to $3 million at this point. And
$3 million a year.
Yeah, and the other component of this is important to know that they also pay state withholding tax. So the reason the state has been a major partner for us in this endeavor is because using the $75,000 number, the state was about to lose $8 million in withholding. So for the state of Missouri, the overall loss, if it had gone to Illinois, would have been between 11 and 13 million on an annual basis.
Do employees within the state of Missouri, they pay that state withholdings tax whether or not they live in the state of Missouri?
That's correct. So, well, no, it's only for Missourians.
It's only for Missouri residents. So if there are Missouri residents who worked at NGA and NGA moved to Illinois, they would still pay the state withholdings tax or not?
No.
If they if they lived in Missouri and their employer moved to Illinois, they would no longer pay that withholdings tax?
Let me hold for a moment and get your question specifically. Say it again.
Missouri residents
Right.
who work at NGA
Right.
currently pay a state withholdings tax. If NGA moved to Illinois, would those same Missouri residents continue to pay the state withholdings tax?
I do not know that answer, but I can get it for you.
Do Illinois residents who work at NGA currently pay the state withholdings tax?
I believe the way the state calculated it, and I will get the state to provide the formula that they use, is that they use the Missouri residents. In this case, over 70% of those that were employed are, I say over 70, between 67 and 70% are Missouri residents working at the NGA.
Is the state withholdings tax based on location of employment or location of residency?
That's the part that I'm saying I'm going to get for you. I don't know.
It was my understanding that it was based on residency and not location of employment.
But either way, Alderwoman, it is the earnings tax here for the city that we're concerned about, and so I brought up.
I would agree with you, but I did not bring up the state earnings tax.
I'm not here to debate or to.
Going back to the questions I had, which.
The state's formula.
which were related to the city's earnings tax, as you pointed out, which was the important piece here.
Yep.
If we estimate somewhere between $2.5 and $3 million a year generated out of these 3,100 employees, how much of that have we pledged to repay the bonds?
$1.5 million.
So what we're talking about is a $1 million a year benefit, direct benefit to the city of St. Louis through the earnings tax. Am I correct?
Correct.
Okay. My further last two questions are related to the default. Is Northside Regeneration in default with regards to other agreements, for example, agreements with LCRA or those other agreements numbering less than 2 hands worth, but more than one with the other agencies?
With your permission, I think it would be best not to answer that question in open session.
With regards to the default and the that we issued on the agreement between Northside Regeneration and the City of St. Louis, is it my understanding that if within the next 30 days Mr. McKee pays his tab and turns the spade, so to speak, that we'll all be good and this will be water under the bridge?
If he should cure all of the defaults that have been cited, then the City of St. Louis will not have the ability to terminate the redevelopment agreement with Northside on that basis.
And will there be leniency regarding the defaults in that agreement?
This is a matter that's not best to discuss in public session.
Understood. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's all the questions I have.
So, Mr. Williams, do we have anyone from the assessor's office available today? Pardon?
I got the information that was in the slideshow and in the event of default letter from the assessor's office. I can tell you a little bit more detail about the taxes if you would like.
I think that's, I mean, it's certainly of interest to me. I'm sure it's probably of interest to some of my colleagues and citizens as well, if you're able to elaborate. I know you're not the assessor.
I'm not the assessor, and I don't play one on TV. But the best of my knowledge, and obviously there are entities that have names other than Northside Regeneration LLC, but in looking at Northside Regeneration LLC, all the taxes were current through 2016. In 2017, there were about a little less than $500,000 of taxes due on all the parcels in that name. And there was a refund that was due for 2016 to the tune of about $200,000. The collector applied that refund to pay a portion of the taxes that were due in 2017. As of the date hereof, those were the only taxes that we know of that were paid in for 2017, and the remainder of the 2017 taxes for that specific entity would remain unpaid. There might be 1 or 2 parcels that are different, like the ones that are being redeveloped, might have had the taxes paid, but basically the only taxes that we know of for that entity that were paid from a refund that was applied to 2017.
And can you explain how a refund would be applied? Most citizens don't get refunds on their property tax bills, so can you explain how?
I don't know how the collector did that. I think they took the refund and applied it to current taxes before sending money back to the owner.
So, and this is probably a question best asked of the assessor's office or the assessor himself, but we were provided a spreadsheet that had the various parcels that are owned by the legal entity within NSR, and I was frankly appalled that there were under 400 of them, almost 400 of them, that pay less than $10 a year in annual property tax. Even for a standard size vacant city lot, it costs a heck of a lot more than $10 a year to provide services to that vacant lot, regardless of if there's a property or people living on it. And, I mean, do we have a baseline for the city of St. Louis in terms of how much it costs to provide services per, acre or what have you, so that we can then determine a baseline for assessments, of vacant lots? I have, vacant lots in my ward, that, might be assessed at $150, I think was the, cheapest one that I could find. But my ward has not fully recovered from the, economic crash of, 2009. I have, in some respects, 30% poverty rates, a lot of the same, demographic issues that, the NSR has. And yet, I have vacant property that is being, assessed at a rate that's, 10, 15 times higher than, what Mr. McKee is paying on his vacant lots. And so, and there's almost 400 of them. And some are as low as, I believe, $3.97, which is just absolutely astounding to me. So are you able to, provide any insight as to how or why, a single parcel in the city of St. Louis would be assessed at such a low rate?
That's a long question, and unfortunately, my answer is no. I think it's a very thoughtful question. I think tax policy is something that we, as a community, need to consider, but we don't assess parcels based on what they cost in terms of city services. We do it based on what's set forth in state law in terms of comparable sales. And I think if you looked at the statistics at the most recent reassessment, the most significant decreases in value because of the lack of development were in a lot of the Northside wards, and it's you're right, the cost of turning the street lights on.
Is essentially driving down his own tax obligation by not.
So are all of the apps, we have, a number of absentee owners, we have about 12,000 parcels of vacant property. And a lot of people, look at vacant property that's owned by, a lot of people and think that it's either LRA property or Mr. McKee property. There are a lot of absentee owners that contribute to the cost of removal of debris. We're mowing lawns or places, where the city owns it and when the city doesn't own it sometimes. And we're, turning the street lights on. And there's a lot of expense that doesn't help people move forward. And we need to think about good, thoughtful tax policy that actually moves people forward and gets the residents the kind of neighborhoods they're looking for.
Sign me up for that. So with regard to vacant buildings, the city has the vacant building initiative. Are Mr. McKee's properties and the other properties that are vacant that are not owned by, one of his entities, are they all registered? Maybe I saw the building commissioner in the back. I don't know if he's still around. But are we making sure that all of those properties are on the VBI, that they're getting, assessed the annual fine, that's,
The building division is about 40% of the way through the analysis of all the vacant buildings in the city, and that was the basis of the information that you saw in the letter. That's where 205 of the buildings were cited for code violations. We'll be getting the notices, and will be part of the vacant building registry and the payments. They were not singled out. That was a citywide analysis of vacant buildings that's being undertaken by the building division. They have much more up-to-date tech on that, and so their ability to cite vacant buildings, get them on the registry, get people notices, and eventually have the fees paid, and hopefully the code violations remediated much more quickly and thoughtfully, and a more comprehensive process. But at this point in time, as to Mr. McKee's, as to Northside's buildings, there are 205 that were found to have code violations at this point in time. It's not everything that they viewed, but it was almost everything that the building division has looked at and analyzed that was owned by Northside.
To your knowledge, does Mr. McKee own any properties that aren't vacant in North St. Louis? And non-commercial, residential?
Maybe there's an office or two. I don't know the answer to that question. I apologize.
Okay. The Alderwoman from the 6th Ward had a related question.
I don't have a question. I just have a comment for everyone that until this past session, McKee's and NSR's buildings were exempt from paying the vacant building registry. We just passed legislation that removed that exemption. So from when that bill was passed in 2009 or 2010, until just this past year, he was not paying that money. So I would be interested to know based on that legislation, which did have an emergency clause and went into effect immediately, if those are included in some of the formulas that you've come up with respect to what he owes the city.
So the 205, 206, I think it was 205 parcels are listed in the event of default letter.
205.
205. Those are buildings that are owned by Northside Regeneration. I think the vast majority of them are in the TIF redevelopment area, though some of them may be in Northside, in Old North as well. So those are parcels that are owned by Mr. McKee, his entity at the LLC. In terms of the areas that were exempted from the vacant building registry, it wasn't just Mr. McKee's, it was anybody who had a Chapter 99 or Chapter 100 or Chapter 353, but in connection with that exemption being removed as to all developers, the building division is reviewing all vacant buildings and has been undergoing that for I think about 2 months now, and is working diligently to get that list up to date, get the registry up to date, and get the letters out notifying people of their code violations. And 6 months after that, then they start, I think it's $200 every 6 months, semi-annually for each of the buildings. So.
Thank you.
So with regard to the redevelopment agreement, does NSR have the ability to change zoning within the redevelopment area?
You know, there's a process, so NSR does not have unilateral ability. They would have to follow the same procedure any developer or any citizen would have to. The answer was, to your question is no, they do not. Where there has been a request that has been it has gone through the process, it has gone through the planning commission.
Planning commission and
yes.
et cetera. So outside of NGA, the NGA specific site, are we aware of any specific zoning changes that have happened? And I thought I saw Don Rowe in the audience, the planning commissioner.
I think there may have been some requests for the current development that's underway. I'm not totally positive, but I do know that they were also going to seek something on Pruitt-Igoe. So it's not unusual to try and seek zoning to be comparable to what the redevelopment is, and so I would expect that to occur.
I completely agree, and my reason for asking that is actually because of the Pruitt-Igoe site and this landfill situation. And I know that you don't want to call it a landfill, but my understanding is that was zoned as a multi-family dwelling district.
But when we actually, at the initial NGA legislation, Pruitt-Igoe was in that geography, because at the time we did not know that we offered 135 acres to the NGA. They chose to take 100, as it turns out, 97.
So did we zone NGA as unrestricted?
There were some zoning changes, primarily height, because of we wanted to ensure them that we would not have buildings that were higher than the facility that they would construct. Mm-hmm. And so that was one of the components, and I can't remember the other.
But they stayed within the regular commercial zoning classifications. They didn't go into industrial or unclassified, right? And so, things like, open storage are generally still cited underneath, zoning, it's being used for a commercial purpose. It's also,
Well, let me go back. That was to be a temporary situation, obviously. It is now taking longer because of the complaint that was generated. And so I think that, the effort to rectify that is one where they have been working with all parties. As I mentioned, they've talked to the school board, to the teachers, to the health department, to all the various stakeholders, and everybody had a solution, except for one or two people. And
I appreciate that. I guess where I'm going, though, is that you said that NSR was the one that allowed them to use that land, right?
But when I say allowed, they were coordinated with. They owned the property, and I'm sure they were coordinated with in order to be able to use it.
And I guess my question is, even if NSR allows them to use it for that purpose, are they allowed, is NSR even allowed to use, are they in violation of our zoning code as a result of having a landfill, on their site.
That's a question for the building department and for zoning.
Okay. And unfortunately, they're not here at the moment. So that's really all the questions that I have, for the time being. I know that there's probably some more on the part of our colleagues, but the two things that I have written down as follow-ups, and there may be others, Otis, but the list of all agreements between NSR and the various city agencies, they are public documents, so I presume that, there shouldn't be any issue in providing those to the body. And then the cost-benefit analysis that was conducted 18 months to 2 years ago, if we could have that. Is there any other documentation that anyone from the committee would like to see? Okay. And could you send that to me and make sure that the clerk is included on that as well? And I'll make sure that it gets disseminated to the committee and, possibly the board if there's interest from them. I do want to afford Mr. Piggy the opportunity. I wasn't planning on having public testimony today, but since the meeting has very much revolved around NSR, providing a legal representative from NSR with the opportunity to, provide their case, I'll do so. Mr. Piggy, you don't want to make any comments? Yeah, I'm going to provide this to the clerk.
Darrell Piggy, I'm an attorney for Northside Regeneration. When we were communicating earlier, Alderman, we weren't sure whether or not we'd have a chance to present, so we'd hope that maybe at another time we'd have a chance to address the committee. A lot of the testimony today was based on the letter that went out yesterday, and really they don't have enough time to effectively respond to the committee properly, but we hope to get the opportunity to do that and look forward.
And I will certainly provide you all with the opportunity to, provide your perspective and side of the story, and also have questions answered from members of this committee as well. And you and I can coordinate a time in which that would be amenable for everyone.
Thank you, Alderman. Just for today, we wanted to submit the memo for the record, what we thought was going to be today's hearing, and we look forward to interacting with the committee later.
Okay, wonderful. And the clerk has a copy of that, and I received that last night around 9 o'clock and sent it out to members of the committee as well so that they have a chance to review it. But I think you might have beat me to the punch and sent it out to the whole board. So so that's on record. But I'll reach out to you and make sure that, we coordinate a time for a future meeting as well.
Thank you, Alderman.
Great, thank you. Okay, I believe that there's a Ways and Means Committee hearing that's being called for 11 a.m. So I'm going to call this meeting of the Neighborhood Development Committee adjourned. Thank you, everyone, for your time and consideration.